And he is a bit more nervous and a bit more vocal about the softening of the employment data than he was before. But I agree with him. I think they would have cut earlier, and I think that they should have cut earlier personally, and that they should be cutting now. But I just don't think it's political. I think they're sticking to the data, and I think they're a bit worried to repeat the 1970s into the 80s.
Alrighty, folks, we are going to talk about inflation. We'll hit on stagflation. We'll hit on the odds of a recession. We're going to have all of this conversation and more with Anna Kelly. But first, I want to ask her, is Jerome Powell being political? Or is he being just true to the data? This is not a question I think I've asked many people, but I am curious. Danielle DiMartino Booth has clearly reversed her opinion. She used to be a stout Powell supporter, and she is flipped. She is saying Powell's being a political hack at this point. But I'm curious, Anna, where do you kind of stand on Jerome Powell? Is he a political hack, or is he just looking at the data?
I believe he's just looking at the data.
I didn't expect that. Okay.
With the caveat that him reversing course, being bullied by Trump weekly, at least in the news, would look like he has caved politically. So if there's any political motivation there, it's probably, I'm not going to cave, to the bully and look like I'm caving politically. I'm just going to continue to stick to the data. But as much as I do think that he's late, and again, he gets all the blame because he's the president, but generally there's 12 Fed presidents that sit on the FOMC, and they rotate, and it's 10 out of 12, not just him, that are holding the line to or dissenting and saying we need to cut because of the softening in the employment data. But he has pretty much said he would have cut earlier had Trump not come out with this 50%, not just retaliatory tax, but a totally different measurement than what the world expected, which really could have sparked extreme inflation in tariffs on imports. And so I think that he has made it clear that had that not happened, he would have said, hey, we need to cut rates. And he is a bit more nervous and a bit more vocal about the softening of the employment data than he was before. But I agree with him. I think they would have cut earlier, and I think that they should have cut earlier personally, and that they should be cutting now. But I just don't think it's political. I think they're sticking to the data, and I think they're a bit worried to repeat the 1970s into the 80s. He does not want to go down with the legacy of being Arthur Burns and having a big double dip inflation hit. He wants to be, more like I'm going to hold the line, and I'm going to make sure that inflation doesn't rear its ugly head. So he's fighting the last battle, the last demon, as you'd say, is inflation. And he's more worried about that and tariffs' potential impact on inflation than he is so far on the employment data.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I've said for quite a while, and frankly still I believe Jerome Powell is playing for his legacy at this point. Yep. I think he understands that a couple of years ago, he was clearly wrong and will be blamed for that. He was too late to raise rates, and frankly, he broke the housing market, and the housing market is still broken. And he knows that, and he is certainly, in my opinion, doing everything he can to bolster his reputation. Because again, he's already rich. By some accounts, he's worth $100 million. He wants to ride off into the sunset in May, write his books, get his speaking fee. But he is playing that game. And I think you brought up an important one first. The thing that he doesn't want to have happen in the last part of his term is for the Fed to lose independence. Right. So I think you brought up an excellent point. The fact that Trump goes so hard, so consistently, it really makes him get in a position, even if the data is questionable, he can't cut rates because he will be accused of wilting at the feet of the president. Absolutely. So he's going to want clear and concise data that's irrefutable. And unless he gets it, no cut. And, at this point, I think it's a 91 or 94% chance that we get a cut in September after today's muted inflation. So I think cuts are coming. I think it'll be interesting, how many this year. I know Michelle Bowman says we're going to cut it every meeting. JP Morgan yesterday said 4 cuts, which means one of these is going to be a 50.
Right.
Which is interesting, or an emergency cut, in fairness. I mean, it's one or the other. So I think there is general feeling that they were maybe too confident in the jobs data, and the jobs data is clearly deteriorated. And oh, by the way, in about 3 weeks, we're going to get another update, an adjustment. And according to Goldman Sachs, they basically said, hold my beer to the last adjustments, that these are going to be nasty.
Yeah.
So that could, you get something like last year where 818,000 jobs just disappear. Yeah, you're going to get a cut in September, and it could be a double. It could be a 50 if we get another massive adjustment. What do you think?
Yeah. And I think there's two important points that just popped in my head based on what we're talking about. The first is most economists, most government economists, I don't remember the exact percentage, but it's huge. It's like over 90% of them are are Democrats. They're registered Democrats. And so if anything, you would think that the economists as a whole, and people talked about potential playing politics at the end of the last administration. Are they just are they just trying to undermine, the election and make sure that Trump doesn't get in because they are Democrats? They're going to be more biased and want to make the economy look better than what it really is. And I did think that could have been at play at the end of last year. But Jerome Powell is a registered Republican, and he was appointed by Donald Trump. Let's not forget. So people that want to, and in deference to Daniel DiMartino Booth, I hear other people saying he's definitely being political, but you have to understand he is Republican. And so his ideology is generally aligned with Trump, but he clearly doesn't like Trump, at least, the fact that Trump is hammering him and blaming him. But I don't believe he's politically motivated. And that's one of the reasons why, right? If he was a staunch liberal or a progressive, you'd be more apt to maybe say that. But the other thing that I think is important, and if you were watching, I believe it was last week, I was in Hawaii for like 10 days and I'm a little jet lagged. So my days are kind of running together, Michael. But I believe it was last week, Trump fired the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics because of the data. And, probably wrongly so, I will say. However, Trump is famous for, you're fired. And so that's what he does. But the reality is the data is not good. And the data hasn't been good for some time. This is not an issue with Jerome Powell or with the FOMC necessarily. But we're getting a declining amount of really reliable real-time data, which is a real problem. When the largest country in the world, let's say one of the greatest financial powers of the world right now, cannot get accurate data, even those that are making decisions like the FOMC, like Jerome Powell, when the data isn't good and timely, and the methods of collecting that data are no longer working, that's a real problem that needs to be addressed. And so we can say, we want to make everything political. It just makes people feel better, right? If we just get a different person, we'll get a better outcome and everything will be rosy again. But there's usually a whole lot more under the surface than just people being political. And I think the data is really the story for me about, the last couple of years. I mean, Powell and all the rest of the FOMC missed inflation because they just thought it was transitory. And some of that was data and some of it was just real shocks, like COVID and things that you don't see coming, not really having models that can play out what is this going to look like. We can, armchair quarterback, Monday morning quarterback and say, hey, they should have seen it. Anytime you print money, you end up with inflation, and we can all see that. But their real-time data, Michael, wasn't good. And so they missed inflation being as bad as it is. And we have the same issue now, and the data. One other quick point, and I know this is kind of long-winded, Michael, but I think I saw a couple weeks ago, 60% of the employment data now is calculated and estimated instead of real. It used to be like 60% was real, coming out of, real data, payrolls and things of that nature, surveys, and 40% had to be extrapolated. Now they're only getting, the survey responses are way down from large and small businesses that answer the surveys that give them the number that they're coming out for jobs. Why were the jobs so missed in the last quarter? Why were they missed by almost 1 million at the end of 2023 going into 2024? Because the data, the surveys are not good. They're not being responded to, and they're extrapolating and making up calculations to report jobs that the market just goes crazy if it's good or bad. It's all calculated, majority calculated. And so we're missing, and then the government's making decisions based on these calculations that are quite clearly wrong. So something has to be fixed, but I would argue it's a data issue more than it is political.
Yeah, I'll tweak that a little bit, but first give a shout out to Michelle Bowman, one of the Fed presidents who did dissent last time. She not only says that 3 rate cuts are coming, but the next comment, and again, I talked about this on my daily financial news. She highlighted the problem with declining reliability in government data.
Yes.
Right. They're basically being asked to fly a plane with data that they can't trust, which I'm no airline pilot, but I'm going to guess that's really bad. That's really bad if you can't trust the altitude and speed and all of that. But I want to go one step further, because I don't think it's the data. And this is just nuanced words. I think it's the process of data collection. The fact that we're using surveys still in a world like they're mailed. Like I don't even check my mail, right? Yes. Everything is electronic today. The fact that we don't send people text messages and say, vote now, or, use AI, or heaven forbid, use something like Trueflation, right? Trueflation has thousands of metrics that are updated every day, or at least the weekdays.
Yes.
We just need to do better.
That was an important nuance. It's the way that we're collecting and calculating and extrapolating data in a world where data is much more rapidly available, to your point.
Hello.
And Trueflation. Why are we still using, methods of,
this is not the 1980s. Yeah. And we wonder why survey responses are down. It's just generational. Right? You built a survey process when you were mailing it to baby boomers when they were in their 30s and 40s, and they're used to that. Now you have business owners who are Gen Z, millennials, or late Xers, and we're all tech people.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So
Did
stop
you
sending us mail.
The household census that still got mailed to us. I was like,
I threw it away.
Come on, the government's still mailing me a census. They have all my data. Look at my tax return. Right?
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's, again, I don't understand the whole firing, but at some point, if you're the leader of the organization who doesn't change in a world of tech, that's a fire. I mean, I would fire my sales leader for doing that.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think when I said that, I was like, okay, he doesn't like that the data was revised, so he's firing the person at the head. But to your point, when the buck stops there, why haven't they made some adjustments?
Hello.
And I don't know how long they've been in office or whatnot, or what projects they may have to try to fix it. But clearly, you have people like Elon Musk, love him or hate him, that's smart, that has these guys who are some of them savants and just extremely intelligent, able to come in and do things like that with Doge. Why couldn't they come in and analyze these systems and say, let's get real-time data immediately? So I think that's going to be kind of the story that's written, when we look back at this era, is all the errors, and hopefully we come out with better data. But they are, because they don't have good data collection, to your point, systems, and they're extrapolating and calculating so many things incorrectly that don't take into consideration things like immigration, for example, and how many workers are on the payrolls or not, are paid under the table, things like that, and how that impacts their models. Their models are taking old data, untimely data, not fuel data, and then they're extrapolating lots of other things. Even people don't realize, even part of CPI and GDP are extrapolated and calculated. The birth death models, of businesses dying and starting and all these kind of things. So much of our data is not real data as we think of it. And so, Powell and the FOMC have this dance where they know this, Michael. They're like, okay, we see some of the softening jobs data, but by and large, it tends to be generally okay. at a high aggregate level. And inflation, it's not perfect, but generally it's aggregating okay. And GDP, it's not perfect, but generally they're within these margins where they're like, okay, if we can get 2 to 3%, even though they say inflation, they want to get down to 2, it hasn't been 2. And some argue that it's never going to be a whole lot better than,
well,
2.5
just
anyway.
on that, I checked Trueflation today. You have any idea what Trueflation says today?
I didn't look today, but I track it.
1.83. So it's below 2.
Below 2. And it's jumped a little, and last week or week before it was up in the 2s again.
Yep.
I thought, okay,
Oh, no.
But yeah. And so it's, somewhere between 2 and 3 is inflation. Somewhere between 3 and 4 is unemployment. And somewhere around 3% right now, as of this morning. Last quarter's GDP came in at 3.1, even though we had a negative 0.5 the first quarter. And so if they are in a general trajectory of we can get GDP above inflation, then the job stuff will work itself out somewhere in that 3, 4. If we have a recession, maybe 5, 6, and then come back down. So generally speaking, as much as I want them to cut rates, and I think that the job market is going to continue potentially to worsen, I think that they're holding steady, Michael, allows them to let more data come in, more of these corrections to happen until they see strong enough evidence that the tariffs are not going to cause more inflation and that the job market is not going to collapse and have a deep recession. They're able to kind of hold, and things are still okay in general at the aggregate.
Yeah, pretty interesting. Again, we got a recession warning this morning from Bank of America. Bank of America highlighted that the last 3 months service demand from U.S. consumers is down. We're talking airlines, hotels, dinner,
Yes.
right? These are things that we go out. And the last time it was down 3 months in a row, 2008.
Yep.
Yeah, that's not good. Now, some of this could just be a kerfuffle around, tariffs, right? Because again, I think, and I've said many times that a lot of people just said, I don't get it. I'm going to stay home. So maybe the first couple of months, so maybe this is not a trend in the making, but this is certainly a yellow flag. Because if we lose the consumer, it's game over for our economy.
Well, that's been the number one thing that I've been harping on, the last couple of years is how long can the consumer hold on in the face of inflation not coming down meaningfully, and now in the threats of tariffs and those types of things. And whether tariffs actually stick it to the consumer and we see real inflation on the things that most Americans buy and sell remains to be seen. But I would argue that with a stretched consumer, which we do have, they're going to push back and say, I'm not going to buy these things. I'm going to buy American made, or I'm going to buy the stuff I have to. And already discretionary spending has been down significantly. So I also read a article. I don't remember where it was, maybe Zero Hedge. And I saved it on my phone to go into the data when I got back from Hawaii. But essentially, it's shown what we've been arguing quite some time is even though at the aggregate, the economy has been stable enough and growing enough that we technically don't have a recession. We have positive GDP at least 2 quarters in a row. So we might have had a negative the first quarter of this year, but then we have a positive the second quarter. So until you have 2 quarters of negative GDP, they don't tend to call recession. However, the data that I saw in this article basically showed that the top 20% of the economy, like we've been saying, is really floating the economy. But they had significant data and they extrapolated it by age groups and demographics and income levels. And it's really that high income level that has stock market portfolios doing great. Their real estate values have done real well. So they've continued to spend. They're the ones still traveling on airlines and still taking bigger vacations. But when you look at the majority of the population, and at this point, it's like 80% of the population, they're struggling more and more, and they're pushing back. They're stopping the eating out. So not just are they not taking expensive airline trips, but they're finally pulling back from, food eaten away away. And the food at home is extremely expensive as well. So when 80% of your population is living check to check, Michael, they cannot continue to handle higher inflation. And now we're starting to see more job layoffs. And in fact, our local areas had a whole bunch of small businesses starting to give more notices and lay people off. So you start to see more and more layoffs of the small businesses, just like the households. 80% are struggling, 20% are doing really well. When it comes to businesses, the big companies in the S&P 500 have had good enough profits that they're able to take a little bit of profit loss and still do well. But it's those smaller businesses, the smaller companies that are starting to really struggle. And I think that's to the Bank of America warning, when you start to look at the fact that this has been going on for a couple of years and businesses and consumers are no longer able to hold on. And it's harder to find a job when you lose your job. So people are rolling off of the unemployment list. They're still unemployed. They just can't find a job and their unemployment benefits have run out. So I think there is still a strong chance of a recession. And in fact, if you go out to the federal websites, you'll also see that the recession warning was triggered again last month, that, hey, these conditions, the leading economic indicators, last time I looked early to mid-July, 7 out of 10 leading economic indicators were now negative. One of the largest percentage, 70% of the LEIs pointing to recession. Stock market's still great, but that's becoming less connected to the real economy. So I still have not backed off the call that we may be in recession and it may get worse. Yeah. The question for me is this big, beautiful tax bill. How much is that going to keep things afloat? Because the top 20 have bigger tax deductions. Businesses can start to write some things off and stimulate the economy enough. Will they stimulate the economy enough to keep GDP high, even in the face of worsening job data? And worsening inflation potentially. And I think that's a possibility. Anything could happen, Michael.
Yeah. Well, the good thing is we will be coming back most Tuesdays to have these discussions. You got an amazing playlist on this channel, but if somebody wanted to follow you or reach out, what do they do?
Great. You can find me on my website at AnnaKellyInvesting.com for wealth and real estate consulting or coaching. You can find me on social media at Anna Kelly, REI Mom, and right here on your channel most weeks.
Thank you so much.